Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Beit Midrash. Good to have you here. Hope everybody's having a good week. Hope everybody is staying warm. Well, the last couple days haven't been so bad, but at least, you know, after midday. Um, but glad everybody's here and doing well, and good to be learning together again. So we are now on chapter 10 of Judaism is About Love by Rabbi Shai Held. Imitating God. And before we jump into it, as always, wanted to open it up to you if you had any thoughts, comments, reactions to this chapter. Yes, Esther.
Um, I actually just read this chapter, which is good because everything's fresh in my mind. But there was one sentence that really struck me personally, and it is on page 241. To commit to a life of love manifested as kindness is to dwell in the only place many of us will ever find God. And as you may have realized, I sometimes have a little issue with God, this God thing. But that sort of rang true to me. The times when I feel most spiritual, I guess, is, somehow when the stars align and I may be in the right place at the right time to do something. Um, and that feels a bit like God, if you.
Yeah, I was going to say, like you were saying that, I was kind of thinking, how many of us remember fondly with warmth the rabbis of our past who browbeat us into learning things or browbeat us into getting ready for our B'nai Mitzvah or things like that, versus how many of us remember rabbis or other spiritual leaders who were warm and loving and that we felt cared by. Um, yeah, that tends to the latter tends to stick with us a lot longer than the former does. And I think that might be a part of why is um, that there's a sense that we feel God within that, and we sense God in those times in a different way than we might in less loving times. Lisa,
Sorry, with my iPad, I have to find that bottom bar
I hear you.
to unmute myself. Oh, hold on. Now I took my picture off. There we go. Okay, now here I am. Okay, well, so one of the things this book actually does for me is it gives me a lot of cause for like self-reflection and like is my outer life reflecting my inner life? Am I truly compassionate or am I more just being sympathetic? So I have to examine myself and how I do. And I think that's a good thing for me to think about. But so one thing that struck me that I struggle with, and I don't know if anybody else does, but this is before you can be compassionate with somebody and loving with somebody, you have to notice. And, you have to notice that they're in a place of need. You have to see them. You have to truly see them. You can be at a party talking to somebody, and, if you're not really seeing them, you might not really notice that they look a little off or they seem a little, you know, sad or seem like something is going on. And, I don't know. I think sometimes I just get caught up in I get rushed and caught up in the everyday life, and I maybe pass by things too quickly, or I'm on to the next thing, and I'm just always struggling to like the slow down and notice step before the compassion.
Go ahead, Barbara.
Well, just in replying to what Lisa said, to make it even more complicated, because one of the things the book talks about is how everyone's needs are individual to them, or maybe even to the time they're in at that moment. And for some people who are struggling, well, what they need at that moment is just to be treated like a regular, like there is nothing wrong. So, if they're at a party, maybe what they want is to just be able to pretend for a minute that everything's fine. So maybe by not noticing you're actually doing the right thing. I mean, that it's so complicated because it's hard to, it kind of like the way Esther said, sometimes if I'm lucky and I'm in the right place and I get the opportunity and I happen to do the right thing. I mean, it takes a lot to get that moment. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'll say first, I think Rabbi Held would be thrilled to hear that it's forcing you to evaluate your inner life and whether your inner life is your outer life is reflecting your inner life. I think you would be thrilled to know that you're trying to do that because of what he wrote. Um, and I think there's something in between, what Lisa, what you're saying, and Barbara, what you're saying. That yes, there are times that somebody might just not want to focus on whatever it is that's bothering them at the moment or whatever it is they're going through. And the most compassionate thing we can do is to allow them that space to just pretend like nothing is happening at that moment. And sometimes you need to notice that person feels or is a little bit off and allow them to give you that message to you of, hey, you okay? Everything all right? You look like, if they want to say everything's fine and all's good, and they want to pretend that, yes, that is the compassionate thing to do. It's like, okay, well, no, I'm here if you need me. Just reassuring them. But I think also somebody noticing that they might look a little off or seem a little off would also be is an important step because maybe they do want help but don't know how to ask for it, or maybe they do want help but not right that moment. TK.
So I really like what Esther, Barbara, and Lisa said, and I totally am in sync with that. One thing I was going to do is apologize for last week when I kind of went off on civil rights. Y'all have to forgive me because I'm in the middle of a book. And but as Barbara was talking about, sometimes you don't really know. Well, let me back up. You don't really know what the right thing to do is ever. And I'm running across several ironies about historically what has happened when what we would certainly think the right thing is one thing and it has unintended consequences that ripple out through history. And the same thing happens in our personal lives, where we think we're doing the right thing and we may not be, when it all unravels and unfolds. But we'll never know uh, that. We just have to muddle along with what we think is the right thing at that moment and hope that our intentions will eventually lead to something good. But we never really know. Enough for now.
That is unfortunately one of the drawbacks to being human. Is
Yeah.
that we are imperfect and we have very limited foresight and foreknowledge, and so we do our best and we try to do the right thing, and sometimes that right thing goes absolutely horribly wrong. Um, Not because we were trying to be mean, not because we were trying to be hateful, just sometimes it just didn't go the way we thought it was going to go, and that's one of the things that's really hard about being human generally.
Well, one of the good examples of that is in the Bethel civil rights experience, where we learned the story of the 19 rabbis who came to Birmingham. So briefly, the story was JTS was having their national convocation, and they heard about what was going on in Birmingham, and they said, "Well, we have to come down there and support, the civil rights movement." Well, they did. They jumped on a plane, but they did not talk to anybody in Birmingham before they came. And it got to be very difficult at 2 in the morning when their plane came in, and what are they going to do? Our representatives, which included Carl Friedman, my uncle, talked to them about what they were already doing, and when they finally got educated in terms of what the local context was. Some of them turned around and left. Some of them stayed overnight. Some of them stayed the weekend. But it totally changed their understanding and their participation. So I think you do have to understand the context of the problems that you're dealing with in order to help solve them.
I also think that sometimes we want to fix things, and we have therapists on here who could talk a lot more about that. But I think sometimes we're not listening. We're just trying to fix things. And that's when I think we kind of maybe are meaning well, but doing harm. So just
Yeah, he gave
expressions and
he gave a great example of that in the book of the woman who came to the Shiva, who maybe wasn't trying to fix, but was trying to diffuse her own fear in that moment. And sometimes that's where fixing comes from, is we feel like, oh, we need to do something not for them, but for us, so that we feel useful. But yes, that's not always the best way to go about it. Margaret?
In reading this chapter, and especially, I don't know, I have a Kindle, so I'm sure I don't have the page that you have, but it talks about learning to be present with people who need comfort and support. And it struck me that it's perhaps not an accident that so many therapists are Jewish.
I had the same reaction to all of that. And somehow that it's intuitive. I didn't learn this in school. And I think that most therapists don't really learn it. They may go to school because they have a natural inclination and interest. But I think about, my first job working with chronic burnt out schizophrenics. And the only thing you could do was be present. It was a powerful, powerful experience. This is 50 years ago for me. And I remember each one of those people to this day.
I'd like to tell a story about that. When I was in my internship, I was assigned a patient he had been a very prominent attorney in the state, and he'd won case after case after case after case. He had contributed, I don't know, he had letters from whatever president it was thanking him for his, he was a really prominent guy. Well, he lost a big case, and he stuck his head in the oven. He committed suicide, and what happened, of course, was he became brain damaged, and he lived. And so he was in long-term care in a VA hospital, and he had people. He'd had all kinds of therapists and so on and so forth, and of course, it made no difference. Well, they assigned him to me, and all he wanted to talk about was football. So we talked about football. I interpreted football as a metaphor for this, and I interpreted football as a metaphor for that, and so on and so forth. And without any reaction. One day I went, but I didn't know anything about football. And one day I went to the hospital just on a weekend, and I sat with him and I watched the football game. He was a Yale graduate, so he was, really intense about Yale football. And I watched a football game with him. Well, the way it was divided was that some of us were therapists for certain people and were the administrators for others. And so the administrators were the people who made decisions about uh, dental appointments and whether they got to go home on leave or so on and so forth. And I was just a therapist for this guy. But his mother didn't understand that. And his mother called me and she wanted to talk about dental work or something, I don't know. But she told me that this man who had had not been doing things for many, many years was coming home by himself on public transportation instead of her sending her chauffeur for him. He was presiding at dinners where people were invited for dinner, and he was reading the newspaper and he was making sense. And none of it was anything that had ever happened in the past. And none of it was anything that had been expected of him. I don't know what ultimately happened because not long after that, it was time for me to leave. And when I told him I was leaving, he never came back to any of his subsequent appointments. So I don't know if that change in his behavior was enduring or whether it went away. But I think it was that was a profound lesson to me about just sitting with people.
Thank you.
To Barty.
Thank you for sharing that, Margaret.
Wait, I feel like I'm missing something though. What was the lesson? Just that we might think we know someone, but we don't because he was doing things you didn't know about? Or do you think by sitting with him that allowed him to start doing these things?
It was my belief and my hope that sitting with him allowed him to do those things and allowed him to create his own change, and that he was being treated like a human being instead of like a vegetable.
Mm-hmm. I think, and I also have experiences like that where you don't know your impact till one day something happens and all of a sudden you realize your impact. And I think that, he talks about this in the book, just being with people and accepting them and being their equal in that sense. Even though it's painful and scary to sometimes do that, if you're really, if you're focused on yourself and thinking this could happen to me, which any of us could be in any of these situations. So I think those things, this whole book is very psychological to me. And, in the end of the chapter, he talks about, well, why is this different from other religions? And this isn't different from other religions. Psychology is psychology. And then, of course, he makes a case for, this is important for everybody. And I believe it is. And of course, Judaism is the plus part, the rituals and the culture and the rules and the laws and the traditions are also part of Judaism. But to me, this is the fundamental piece of Judaism that speaks to me.
Yes, and he says something very similar to what Rabbi Artson used to tell us in rabbinical school as well. Towards the bottom of 239, he says, if we study Torah and it does not render us kinder and more willing to be present with people facing crisis, sorrow, or loss, then it is not Torah that we have studied. And more broadly, Rabbi Artson used to say it slightly differently, that if you are interpreting a Torah that is not full of chesed, full of kindness and love, then you are not proper, and you believe that God has given us this Torah out of love, then you are not properly interpreting Torah. But, broadly speaking, that's what Jewish ritual is supposed to do in itself. It's not supposed to make you more, I do believe this strongly. It's not supposed to make you more angry or oppressive or hate-filled or anything else. It's supposed to make you more loving towards everyone. It's supposed to make you see the world in a way and connect you with God, who demands that love of us, or at least demands that we love God. And as he says, as Rabbi Held says elsewhere, like, you love God, you got to love God's creation as well. And so Judaism should be driving you to greater love along the way. All of which is agreeing with you, Esther. But
I don't mind saying something that may be controversial, hopefully not too much. But I read about this thing about fixing it, we were just talking about fixing it. It reminded me that classically, men like to fix things, right? And women just want to be listened to. You read that a lot, right, Esther? Right. Well, so it made me wonder whether some of these things we're talking about are what I call feminine characteristics. I mean, men can have feminine characteristics, women can have male characteristics. It's sort of a continuum in there. And so acts of loving kindness, which I think is the largest single word that this chapter is trying to relate to us, acts of loving kindness. Is that more a feminine characteristic, or is it a male characteristic, or do you believe this at all?
He does push back against that idea in the chapter. Somebody can find it quicker than I can. He does push back pretty strongly about the idea. I think it's a 236 to 237.
Yeah.
Begins at the bottom of 236. I think we found it at the same time. I think there's a fascinating midrash, or actually series of midrashim, about if going back to creation, if Adam was created in God's image, what does that image look like? One rabbi, I was recently looking over this, so remember it pretty well. One rabbi makes the argument that Adam was created kind of androgynous, like neither gender, or maybe both genders, depending how you want to look at that. One rabbi makes the argument that Adam was kind of a formless being until God breathed a neshama, a soul, into him. In which case, that one would be kind of, God's image is neither male nor female. God's image is spiritual, not physical. But I think maybe more relevant to what you're asking about, Stuart, is there's another feeling that God created Adam as both male and female back to back. And that Adam and Eve were created kind of as a back to, almost like a Siamese, what we'd imagine Siamese, but back to back. Conjoined twins, I think that's the proper term now. And that when God decided to create Eve, God split them down the side and then gave each of them a back. Which is where I'm going with all this, is that I think putting things into male and female categories continues this kind of idea that we are completely different creatures altogether. Um, I think what Rabbi Held is trying to argue here is really we're not, and that men have the same capability of um, acts of loving kindness or presence. We have the exact same capability. We just have to foster it. And that what I think what you're terming as more male and female characteristics are more societal driven, but not spiritually driven. And I think the argument, both that I think these midrashim are making and that Rabbi Held's making, is that really there's not a difference. Any differences other than biology, the differences spiritually are really about what we as society have created, not about anything that is actually inherent within us.
It's interesting to me. Well, I appreciate all of those points of view, and I don't certainly have an answer. The hormonal side of this, it's just a continuum, right? There's people with very, very strong male hormones, females. And then there's this mixture in between. It's like a transitional. And even with what's going on now in society about people talking about more their gender tendencies more, I don't see that there's a difference, as you were saying, Rabbi, from my point of view, except in the middle, I see more similarity in that hormonal mix. Just that is biological. I mean, you can tell very early on, according to the Children's Hospital person over here, that a child has more tendencies to be a certain way, and they may hormonally be that way. It may not show up in their breast or in their, genitals, but you'll hear from a mother, they'll say at age 5, I knew my daughter was going to, want to be a man or something like that, even though gender, if you take a test, they may not be. So I don't know all how that works. But I do know the culture is very strong. And I do know in most cultures, not all cultures, but in a vast, vast majority, that women, because they give birth and they feed the child directly from their bodies, and so forth. And they tend to look in your eyes. If you notice in all cultures, and there's just a connection with women that I don't see the men having the same connection, because I don't think they actually try or look at each other that much. But it's just very interesting. But I think we all have the capacity to increase our love, no matter where we are on the spectrum.
And yes, biology does affect behavior. There's no questioning that either. Christine?
Hearkening back to some of what Stuart said and what you just said, Barbara. Now, I know there are always exceptions to the rule, but from a practical sense, my husband is very much a fixer. And what he does on the weekends is he volunteers with a group that builds wheelchair ramps for folks that can't afford that kind of thing, but need them for mobility reasons. And I would say that is very much an act of loving kindness. Yes, he's fixing, but it's an act of loving kindness. And to what you just said about men not looking babies in the eyes, my dad was the one who looked me in the eye always from the very beginning. And my mom told me that for years. And when he was on his deathbed, it was reversed. I was looking into his. And that immediate bond that he had established from birth was we could just look at each other and we didn't have to say anything.
And that's an interesting perspective too, is that we might have different methods and ways of showing our loving kindness, which might be biologically driven in some sense, and maybe some sense that we don't yet completely understand, but that doesn't mean we are less capable of demonstrating it. Margit?
Two remarks in connection with what Barbara Royal said. The first one was that I read an account recently that was very interesting about testosterone and the and what it and I must have been in it. It must have been in monkeys and not in some kind of monkey and not in people. But anyhow, what it showed was that the animals with the highest level of testosterone were not the leaders. Animals with lower testosterone, moderate levels of testosterone were the leaders. So that was one remark. The second one has to do with socialization. Um, you may know that I have a grandchild who is many years younger than the older two. And as it happened, when that child was born, um, her father was able to get parental leave. So he was home for 3 months. And the difference between the bond, but later, and when the big kids got older, they formed the same kind of close bond with their father. But at a very early age, he was the main for 3 months. He was the main caretaker, and the amount of the bonding has been at an early age very much stronger. So I think there's a real big socialization issue that comes into play in the parental caring.
Yes, TK.
Very interesting. Two things. First of all, I would argue that what we think of as a split between biological motivation and whatever otherwise is a kind of false dichotomy, because I think we are just now beginning to understand how much the mind body is one thing. Then I'll put a period at the end of that. The other thing I was thinking of, Rabbi, and I wish you would, when you talked about male and female characteristics, would you kind of take us back in time to like the Hebrew thoughts about the male femaleness of God before the destruction of the temple the first time, when a a goddess was both there in Judaism and either as one entity or as two. You know what I'm talking about, the Hebrew goddess and Patel and all that.
I will broadly say that's not my forte. Um, there's some evidence in the Torah that the ancient Israelites were not necessarily monotheistic. So there's a I say there's a book out there that has a fascinating title, and I will disclaim that I have not read the book, so I cannot actually vouch for it. But the book is called From Gods to God, and it tries to it is an academic book, but it tries to trace how the ancient Israelites went from polytheistic to a monotheistic religion, and how that evolved and concretized. So were there ancient Israelite goddesses? Maybe, but it's very. Were there Canaanite ones? Absolutely. Were there Israelite ones? A little harder to actually tell. So this is again not my forte and not my specialty, so I'm not going to speak much just because I don't know enough to speak intelligently about it. Barbara?
Um, there was one little part of this. I really love this chapter, except there was one part that I underlined because it really got me mad. And it's when he talks about, he's trying to talk about, well, beyond being a good person is what the little area is called. And he gets frustrated when his students say, "Oh, you mean I just need to be a good person?" And then he said, basically, if being a nice person, which already he's changed it from a good person to a nice person, being a nice person means saying please and thank you, being reasonably polite, and not committing any egregious interpersonal crimes, then no, that's not at all what these texts are speaking about. Well, I don't think that is what I think what his students are trying to tell him is that, and I believe this too, that we don't necessarily need God to understand these sorry, my dog wants to go outside, understand these duties, and the importance of caring for each other. So I think that's a reasonable conversation to have. I think that there is something definitely spiritual about the connection between people, but and for him it's God, but I don't think that without a belief in God, this is meaningless to the rest of us. So I think he's too dismissive of his students who he takes as being condescending, but maybe they're not being condescending. Maybe they're being, the God part doesn't speak to me, but being a good person does speak to me. So
Um, Perhaps what I took out of that section was that what what the Torah is demanding of us is more than just being a good person, and that the Torah is demanding a higher level of goodness than
no, the Torah is
please and thank
defining what
you.
a good person is. I mean, a good person, yes, it's a high level of what a good person is, but for me, it's just defining what a good person is. It's not saying you have to be more than good. This is what being a good person involves. It means, you know, caring about people, not having pity, but having compassion, all the things that we talked about. That is being a good person.
So part of what I think your machloket with Rabbi Held would be, your dispute with Rabbi Held would be on defining what is a good person. And I think what Rabbi Held is trying to argue is you can be a good person, like there's being a good person and there's being something beyond that the Torah is trying to push us to do. And to that is to embody kindness, and become loving towards other people. I can be a good person and write a check to a homeless shelter to support them and not really care about what they're doing. I can say thank you to somebody and not really mean it. And I try not to, but I catch myself doing it. I can be walking by and say, "Hey, how are you?" and then just keep walking before they get a chance to answer. I mean, I did the nice thing. I asked them how they were. I didn't stop long enough to pay attention to them, but I at least acknowledged their presence. I think for Rabbi Held, he'd say, like, that's being a good person. You're giving to tzedakah. You're acknowledging somebody else's presence. You're saying you're being polite. It's like, but what the Torah is demanding is something beyond that. To feel like I can be an actively a good person and an emotionally not good person. And he's trying to push to say your inner you should be emotionally a good person. That should be reflected by your outside actions as well. I think what your dispute is, well, no, like you wouldn't be as good of a person. You wouldn't be that good of a person if you're doing those things, and that the things that he's describing is what actually should be making a good person, right?
I think our common ground is I do believe the Torah helps us understand what being a good person is. I think that it can happen without having God in the middle of it. I don't think that that's a necessary piece of it. Because he interjects, this is what God expects. That's why we're doing it, is because God expects us of it. But we can also expect it of ourselves once we understand that this is a higher way to be.
Yes, he's a theologian, so he's always going to think in God language. But yes, Esther.
What I was reading into it, and I'm not saying I disagree with you, Barbara, but what I was reading in this chapter is that the Torah wants this to be the guiding star. And it's kind of what Lisa started off with. And I had the same experience, really questioning, am I really there? Am I doing this? And I think, someone who even says, oh, I'm already a good person is not really looking and not using that as their guiding star in a way. And I think that was what the message was. I don't want to get off the topic. I know Lisa had her hand up, but I want to raise one other small issue that I hope we can talk about, and because I have difficulty with it, and it's the stumbling block issue. Do you give the money to the homeless? Do you give them food? Do you walk away? What do you do? I brought it up last time. It's still a struggle for me.
Yeah,
But
I don't think there's an exact answer to it, and he kind of says it. It's a case by case basis.
Yeah.
Like if
I've heard it both ways, that we should not be judging what people do with their money, and that treating someone with dignity is just give them whatever they're asking for, or whatever.
I think on some level, I think the solution is you, and this might be the only way to really think about it, is you give them the benefit of the doubt and don't judge what they're going to do until you know what they're doing with it. So, if you give somebody $10 and then you see them walk into the liquor store, then you can say, okay, maybe I'm not giving that person $10 again because I'm putting a stumbling block before them. But yes, it's hard to do unless you actually know what they're doing with that money. And I'm not sure there's a real solution to it other than to give the benefit of the doubt until you know otherwise. Lisa, you did have your hand up before.
Yeah, but this is on, I have a different question. So if anybody wants to stick with that same point, do you want to stick with that same issue any longer? A little bit longer and then come back to me?
Margaret looks like she wants to.
Just one brief comment, and that is, if the way I think about it is if I see somebody with a gun and they ask me for some bullets because they're depressed, I'm not going to give it to them. So I think there's sort of that limiting case where somebody's going to be doing something self-destructive. You're not going to give them the benefit of the doubt. You're going to do something else.
And Pastor, I'm still in the middle as you are, just because I feel bad when I don't follow through, because what the rabbi is saying is, how do you know this isn't the time that they really want to take this money and go back to their family, get that bus trip back, or they're saving for something they say they're saving for, or they are going to feed their kid. So erring on that side tends to be what I do, unless I've been told. I remember we were in a small Mexican town and there were a lot of women begging on the streets, elderly women, and then there were some young women with little kids, and we were told that gangsters or whatever used them. They used those women and they took their money, and they kind of kept them in the homes. But what this town did was They had every Wednesday for all the people. They had and a lot of the people in the village participated. They had feedings where they would keep feeding those. And even though they knew they were working for the bad guys, they kept feeding those people. So, dilemma.
All right, Christine.
Sometimes too, when it, speaking of a case by case basis, sometimes when it comes to folks asking for money, it can be an issue of perceived personal safety. For instance, if I'm alone in 5 Points and I'm a fairly small of stature woman, and a big guy comes up to me asking for money, I'm just going to hurry along and I'm not going to give money, but I'll go home and make a donation to Alabama Food Kitchen or whatever. But if I'm with my husband, he might feel more comfortable actually giving money. I mean, I think personal safety has to come into consideration too. And I think often, sometimes men don't think of safety as an issue the way women do, the way women have to, frankly.
That's male and female characteristics, huh? Oh, getting mad. But I do want TK, since TK writes about biblical times and about historical times, that we all should remember what Aristotle called phronesis. Do you remember that? Phronesis, which is practical wisdom, which I think summarizes a lot of what we're talking about, which is the rabbi saying our inner self and our outer actions need to be in synchrony. That will be the best thing. And we've talked many times just about Judaism, the religion of action. We don't just think about things, we put things into action. And so that's what Aristotle, I think, is talking about, practical wisdom.
That's in this chapter.
Pardon me?
That's in this chapter.
Yeah, no.
Oh.
Right. That's why I was mentioning it.
All right, Lisa, what were you going to ask?
Okay, so yes, on another thing he talks about on page 237 is the negative part of society, men encouraging women to be so self-sacrificing that they lose their sense of self. And so he really sort of, pushes back on the fact that you can go too far in that direction and be so giving that that becomes your whole life and you don't have a self anymore. And so it made me think of our prayer, the Beit Midrash, which really does, I don't know all the words to it, so maybe you can speak to this, Rabbi, but I know some of the words do praise women for being self-sacrificing. So I'm just wondering, is that maybe, is there a little bit of a negative twist to that, in that's a primary thing that women are being praised for? And on Shabbat, I think the husband's supposed to sing that to his wife.
Yes. I laugh a little bit because I did that way after my wife and I got married, and at some point, not long after, she's like, "I don't want you saying the same thing to me every week." So she now every week I have to give her 3 reasons why I love or appreciate her in the last week.
I like that a lot better.
And she said, and if I use something that may have happened each of the last 2 weeks, she's like, no, you said that last week. Think of something else. I'm like,
oh my gosh, that's a lot of pressure to come up with something new every week. I guess it makes you pay attention.
So here's, I think, maybe a different question is things like, as he kind of says, things like tzedakah or chesed, or some would say, as he says, self-sacrifice, are not necessarily bad things, as he kind of points out. There's a 236, 237, he talks there's a part of this where you're supposed to be giving of yourself.
Right, you're right. It's just excess.
So this is it is an interesting question, because on some point we should be praising people who do that. And perhaps in Solomon's view, Solomon largely is attributed the book of Proverbs, from which Shai Held comes from. It's the last chapter of the book of Mishlei, of the book of Proverbs. Maybe on some level, yes, there is something maybe a little sexist about Solomon praising women for their self-sacrifice. And I think part of the question is, if we're only praising women for their self-sacrifice, then yes, I think we're kind of perpetuating what he's talking about here, of overdoing it to the point that women are encouraged to lose their sense of self because they're always giving, because that's what we're praising. Positive reinforcement is effective. But if we're also praising men for it, is that, does that balance the equation or no? If we praise men for also being self-sacrificing, one, I guess, part one, are we then encouraging men to that same level of self-sacrifice as women, and to the point that they also might be losing their sense of self? Or might it be balancing it out so that, we're encouraging chesed as a attribute, but not, it's not limited to one gender or the other. I don't necessarily know the answer to that. I think broadly what Eshed Chayil is largely praising is that the ideal wife is not only looking out for herself, but is also looking out for her community and her family and everybody else. I do think there's a level at which it's saying she's looking out for everybody, and that's what we want to encourage, is somebody who's looking out for everybody. You and Rabbi Held make a fair point that perhaps that could be encouraging behavior that might be detrimental in terms of gender roles.
I thought his explanation of saying yourself just needs to be one of the people you put into the group of people you're helping. That makes perfect sense.
Yes, I agree.
And also, I point out Barbara Brandy's note about the reference on page 469 talking about this. Barbara, did you want to?
No, we were running out of time, so I figured I wasn't going to talk about it. I just stick it in the chat for people to look at. I think it's very valid, though, what it says about how far self-sacrificing can go, and that the observed result is not necessarily a good thing. But since I do have the floor for a minute, I got the impression that Rabbi Henkin sort of equated Hesed and self-sacrifice, and I don't think we should do that. Maybe I misheard him, but Hesed doesn't have to be self-sacrifice to the extent that we're talking about self-sacrifice in a negative way here. So,
yes, Chesed. There is a circle here, or at least there is a balance. You can't have too much chesed in the chesed, in a sense. I think I've shared before. There's a midrash about God creating the world purely on the attribute of judgment, and that world very quickly fell apart, because if we were judged on every little transgression that we committed, or if we judged each other on every transgression we committed, the world would very soon collapse. We'd all be dead pretty quickly. So God tried to go to the other spectrum and created a world purely out of chesed, of kindness. And what happened in that world? Everybody starved to death. Because everybody was so busy giving everything to everybody else and say, oh, you look hungry, take my food. And oh, you look hungry, take my food, that nobody actually ever ate anything. And so that world also very quickly perished. Yes, there needs to be some balance between the two, a balance between looking out for others, but as the quote was often circulating over the pandemic, you can't fill from an empty cup. So that you do need to take care of yourself as well. But if you're only, as the famous Hillel quote is, if you are only looking out for yourself, then you're kind of missing the point of your existence as well. Before we wrap up, I do want to draw attention to one section, particularly on 239. Though he says it also, there's also another part on 240. If we, it's in the middle, if we really come to know God, it seems to say, we will become more like God. Love a loving God, it promises, and you'll work to become more loving yourself. This, of course, raises the question every religious person ought to ask. And this is maybe the important one. Is the God we love loving enough? Or have we cut God down to our own size so that God loves whomever we love and hates whomever we hate? The problem is that God is not God at all. It's just an inflated version of ourselves, or in more traditional terms, an idol. So, if we, and this maybe ties in a little bit with what I was just saying too. If you say, God wants me to take care of myself. God wants me to make sure I have what I need. God wants me to have a bigger house. God wants me to have another car. Then at some point, is that God that we're believing in loving enough? Or have we transformed that God into what we want that God to be telling us? And if you are a religious person, that should be a constant challenge of, am I living up to what God is demanding of me? Or am I limiting what I think God is demanding of me so that I don't have to do as much? And that is a really important question to be asking. And as he says on the next page, on 240, my goal is to make life harder for believers, not easier. Make sure your religious life in general, and your religious study in particular, makes you kinder and more present, because after all, that's ultimately what it's all about. To put it differently, as I often say, if it was easy, God would not be commanding us to do it. This is not easy work to be doing. This goes again a little bit to what Barbara was talking about before. This is not easy. This is really hard, challenging, demanding work that the Torah is, that at least as he's interpreting it, that the Torah is putting on us. And it's a constant question we have to be asking ourselves of, am I actually doing what the Torah demands of me enough? And if we think we are, the chances are we're probably not. But even if we think we are, then the question is, are we actually doing what the Torah demands of me, or am I limiting what I think the Torah demands to what I want it to be saying? In which case, that's where he says we're turning it into an idol. We would like to think that being loving and to being kind is easy. It really, it isn't always. Those of us who have been married for a significant period of time, no, we love our spouses, but it's not always easy. For those of us who are parents, We love our children dearly. It's not always easy to love them. Doesn't mean we don't. It just means it's real. Sometimes it takes a little more effort and work on our part to do so. And that's the challenge for us, is to recognize the demands are really high, and it's our job to try to meet them. I'm trying to remember the exact quote. Oh, I have it over here. Wow. We're all pretty familiar with. I think we're all pretty familiar with the Rabbi Tarfon quote that it's not upon you to finish the task, but neither are you free to desist from it. Yes? There's more to that teaching that we don't usually quote. It actually begins, Rabbi Tarfon taught, the day is short, the task is great, the workers are sluggish, the reward is bountiful, and the master is insistent. We have a limited amount of time to do a very large demand of what God is asking of us. It can be very hard for us to get up the energy to always do it. The reward is great, but God is demanding it of us nonetheless. So it's hard work, but God willing, it pays off as well in the way that we live our lives and the meaning we derive from our lives and the spirituality we get from connecting with God through these acts of love and of kindness.
Well,
Any concluding thoughts, comments?
Thank you, Rabbi.
Everybody stayed on for 10 extra minutes. I'm impressed.
Great class.
So, kol hakavod, everyone. We're going to continue next week with chapter 11. It's a significantly shorter chapter in terms of length. I haven't read it yet, so I don't know if it's shorter in terms of content, but I'm sure we'll figure it out by next week. But kol hakavod, good learning with you, and it's supposed to be cold again this weekend, so stay warm. I hope you'll join us for Low Waste Shabbat on Saturday. Our Social Action Committee has been very busy working on that. And so if I hope to see you there, and if I don't, Shabbat Shalom. And if I don't see you after that either, Shavua Tov. And I look forward to seeing y'all next week for class.
Thank you.
Lisa, what kind of dog do you have, Lisa?
She's a Labradoodle.
Oh, she's a
Labradoodle.
big dog. You couldn't.
Bye, y'all.
Hi,
Bye.
y'all.